Welcome to episode 645 of the Barcelona podcast, brought to you by the Blue Wire Podcast Network. I am Dan Hilton, and as evidenced by this show's title, we're going to have to go all the way back to the origins, even of Barca Blog with Frances, 14 years ago, with one of those formats that is an oldie but a goodie. There was so much news this week, and even just in the last 48 hours. And maybe by thinking back to that team 14, 15 years ago in 2010, here's hoping that the 2025 version of FC Barcelona does a similar amount of winning. Now, if they are going to win their first trophy of this season, unfortunately, as a programming note, I will not have a watch-along for El Clasico on Big Up on Sunday, but I will still have the 5 headlines, and I will be back for another watch-along on Wednesday for the Copa del Rey against Real Betis. So that's all the good news. You will not see me on Sunday. I had some prior commitments, unfortunately, in the sports world, but you will hear from me for the 5 headlines, and I will be watching that match regardless of not being able to see me in live time. Becoming a member for free on Big Up does help me out more than you know, as is becoming a Patreon or getting something from the merch store. And lastly, subscribing on YouTube, leaving a comment and a like on this video, or giving a good rating on the podcast apps if you have me in your ears. That all does wonders for me, especially here in 2025. All right, with that, let's get into the top 5 news of what has been a crazy, crazy week in Barcelona world. Our first piece of news is about Laporta's win-lose situation with the ruling kind of finalized. And I put quotes on that because it's really a matter of kicking the can down the road a bit about the Olmo and Pau Victor situation. So at the moment, here is the very good news. Dani Olmo and Pau Victor have been officially registered to play in the Liga. And with that registration, they're eligible to play until April 7th. And this is why I say kick the can down the road, because the deadline for the CSD to issue a final decision on the appeal, that is the court, would have that as the deadline. So that is why April 7th is the new deadline. But again, they have been registered in the Liga. So in the short term, this is all good news. And if Barcelona were to have them until at least April 7th, by that point, it would all be good news because the second leg of the semifinals of the Copa del Rey is scheduled for April 2nd. So in theory, they would have them for most of that competition. And as for the Champions League, Barcelona could be in the quarterfinals as the round of 16 matches are in March. So they could be in a really good spot with Dani Olmo and Pau Victor, even if the ruling on April 7th doesn't necessarily go Barcelona's way. For Laporta, the news was definitely a win, and he celebrated it aplenty, but he may have taken a loss for his behavior with that victory. He reportedly was yelling insults at members of the RFEF during Barcelona's Super Cup victory. Now the REF, that is the federation, so that is the Liga, then there's the Spanish Federation, are reportedly considering filing a complaint against him. Aggregators and those who do call for Barcelona's downfall did say that that would mean that he would have to resign, but that is a bit hyperbolic in terms of what the sanctions or punishment for him would be. In truth, the sanctions would be less than that, but it's still something that won't be positive news for the Barcelona president, who will be looking towards re-election in 2026, as the vote of no confidence in this last week didn't really gain any proper traction for a motion of censure against Laporta. Now, the other little bad news for Laporta this week is that Julie Gu, Barcelona's vice president of marketing, did resign following everything that happened with Nike. There was reportedly kind of a go-around. An intermediary was used with a huge commission that Laporta has been using for some time, as opposed to directly going through Nike in all facets of this contract. And so the vice president of marketing didn't like how that all went down and announced his resignation. And we do know, not only under Laporta, but Bartomeu and every president, that conflicts do happen, and board members and staff members do resign for a host of different reasons. But this is just another one of those negative stories on Laporta's plate in what has been a pretty tumultuous week for the Barcelona board. Our second piece of news is the big one. I probably could have just done an entire video on this, but it is all about the Ronald Araujo transfer buzz. Because as you know, what I always say about transfer buzz is when there is smoke or repeated smoke for a number of days, there definitely is fire. And this is one of those stories with Ronald Araujo that it's so true. You kind of have to figure out which parts of the truth are more right than others based on the journalists and the time period in which things are leaked. And that's kind of what I'm going to do here with the Ronald Araujo news. Maybe it was just frustration being leaked from his camp, having not gotten off the bench against Athletic Club, as to him wanting to leave. That's originally what I thought, but in the last 48 hours, it has definitely become something much, much more. Here's the facts that we know as of Friday afternoon on the East Coast when I'm recording this, and likely this is being released on Friday night, Saturday morning. So something could have even changed in the next 10 or so hours. Araujo's current salary puts him 11th on the wage bill. That's behind Koundé, Inigo Martinez, and Christensen. His renewal is still not done, and there has been no major progress in negotiations while he was on the sideline with those injuries for those months. Here is what is very likely true. Arsenal and Juventus are sounding out Araujo's camp to see if they can grab him at the right price, especially Juventus, who seems hell-bent at the moment for bringing him in. But I will say this buzz isn't just coming from Araujo's camp. Journalists who tend to put a positive spin on Barcelona news in favor of the club just so happened to remind us this week that Inigo Martinez has an automatic 1-year renewal clause in his contract that will be activated if he plays at least 45 minutes in 60% of the matches. And apparently, this is just those journalists reporting, the club is very happy with his performances the same day that the Araujo news really started to pick up steam. We also know that Jonathan Tah is very close to Barcelona. That's one of those we've heard it over a number of weeks and months, that where there's smoke, there is fire. And he would be coming as a free agent in the summer, as Christensen also isn't likely to leave. So that means you've, in theory, next season already got 5 center backs, and the competition for Araujo is just going to get more difficult for a player that has had his fair share of injuries over the course of his career. Here's the other thing that started as a rumor, but at this point we kind of can say is fact. Reportedly, the club does not want to loan out their best pure defender, which for this season makes sense to me. And when I say best pure defender, of course, you know, I mean in terms of not only physicality, but as a presence, a sheer presence at the back. And it is hard to argue that when healthy, he is not one of the best physical specimens on the defensive end in all of world football. But Barcelona also reportedly open to getting something back on the year and a half of his contract, so they are willing to open up negotiations. Arsenal and Juventus are the two teams being most heavily linked. Apparently, the player wants the Premier League, and the Italian club very much want the player. So it's Juventus, the Italian club, at this moment, because they do have a need for center backs at the back, who are pushing the hardest for his signature. So that's all the transfer truce. And now I do want to go under the surface a little bit and kind of talk to the detractors here that say that Barcelona need to make this deal for 50. It sounds like that's what they're willing to accept, which I think that the market for Araujo should start at 70, but hey, what do I know? So if that's the case and Barcelona are willing to accept 50, it does start to bring questions on whether or not Barcelona financially do need to do this deal. And obviously with the registration of Olmo and Pau Victor, the issues that Barcelona having registering players because of their finances is at the top of everybody's mind. As I did talk about on the watch long on Big Up against Athletic Club and wrote about on Barca blog, the club's financial future moving forward into the summer is much different than it is at this moment. Barca Vision, which was formerly Barca Studios, which the club owns 51% of, did not receive the proper installments from some of the other investors of the subsidiary company, which is what Barca Vision is. And when I say those other investors, we're talking about Liberto, as well as the Nike deal still being on the finish line and the Camp Nou still not being opened. It makes sense that the guaranteed money that Barca anticipated for the budget that the Liga approved prior to January was still in flux at the moment, and that complicated the registration of Olmo and Victor. But all of that bad news should be, and I do say should be here, rectified by the end of the season. So I do want to throw some water on the flames that said that Barcelona needed to sell Araujo for a big number. But if he does actually want to leave and won't be renewing, then the club would be wise to part with him. That is true, regardless of what you see of him as a player. The real question is what their negotiating power is at this moment. Because I've complained now for years that Bartomeu, maybe the worst thing he did for Barcelona in the transfer market was put them at a place of loss in terms of salary negotiations, not only with his own players, but with players coming into the club and transferring in. Yes, of course, the allure was to live in Barcelona, as I've said, is one of everybody's favorite things and reasons why it's hard to get players to leave, but also to play with Lionel Messi. Those are the two big selling points to free agents or other players from other clubs while Bartomeu was in charge. But by having the salary structure be the way it was really hard to negotiate down to new signings who Barcelona was spending big money on. So I do think that this deal for Araujo, whether it's in his renewal or with some kind of deal for Juventus or Arsenal, whoever it may be, the negotiating power for Laporta and company is something that I really got my eye on here. Because even with all his injuries, the 25-year-old, he makes a very reasonable salary for a player of his abilities. So anything short, as I said, of 70 million should be not laughed at, but I don't know, I'd sigh-eyed a little bit. If a club were to sell him for less, well, then I think that is some kind of an answer as to how they feel about their current finances and what their finances will be for next season's calendar year of 25-26. Because on the other side of that argument, selling him for more than that could very much help Barcelona out in the long run. Even if Araujo is one individual good player, Ta and Christensen, they don't do what Araujo does, and Inigo Martinez is not the long-term option. But those options could still be good enough for a team on the rise next season that in the second year of Hansi Flick might be much more comfortable with the unit that they are. So that was the big piece of news. Here's a little minor transfer buzz piece of news about Ansu Fati. It seems like the news about Ansu Fati being transferred in January is that there really isn't much news, actually. Ansu Fati was left off the bench, so not sitting on the bench, but left off the bench up in the stands for the Spanish Super Cup semifinal against Athletic Club, with Hansi Flick instead opting to go with Toni Fernandez. Now, this could have something to do with Flick wanting another option for Lamine Yamal on the right, who wasn't totally match fit, as we know, but it could also do with him not trusting Ansu Fati and maybe seeing him out the door in January. My initial thought when I saw this was that his agent, that being Ansu's, Jorge Mendes, who also is Lamine Yamal's agent and a number of other players in the Barcelona squad, that they're starting to work behind the scenes to find him a new home as soon as this January. But reports are that Ansu was surprised about being left out and the player doesn't plan on leaving, even if the club wants to sell him, which hasn't been totally confirmed. And very much like Araujo, selling Ansu Fati would still be beneficial for Barcelona if they could get that deal done for two reasons. Firstly, he's an academy product, so they don't have to worry about the amortization on his deal that ends in 2027 going against their cap. Secondly, his close to 14 million euros salary that he makes, which reportedly is third on the team behind Lewandowski's 33 plus and De Jong's 19 plus, with a 6.2 million owed deferment, is a lot of money for Ansu Fati and still more than Koundé's 13.5 and Rafinha's 12.5. To loan him again would likely require the club to pay some of that salary owed for the second half of the season, and for the level he's currently playing at, it may be hard to find clubs that are willing to take on his salary remaining this season. Though I will immediately push back against that because there are clubs that I think believe in him the way that I still believe in Ansu Fati. I think for what Ansu's reputation still is, even after all these snake-bitten years, he is still just 22 years old, and there is still a player in there that a club may feel like, hey, if we loan him now and prove to be a good home, then he can renegotiate with us for a different contract. And if we're the ones who can revive his career, then we might be able to get him in the summertime for a nice little bargain. I have always wanted desperately for Ansu Fati to succeed at Barcelona, but in my gut, this does have all the rumblings of a deadline day deal to me, at least on loan this month, which would likely mean he is gone in the summer, though. If he leaves now, I just can't see him returning another time, even though he does have a contract for 2 more years. Sevilla and Girona are the two clubs that have been floated about. Those are two clubs that I'm not sure want to take on that salary, so I really don't think that Jorge Mendes and Ansu Fati, if they are looking at clubs, have found the right club just yet, because I don't think that club is going to be in Spain for a number of reasons. So there you go. Ansu may be watching much of the remainder of the season from the stands, which I think would be really unfortunate for him, really the worst place for him. So I hope for his career, he might go on loan, but obviously the best case scenario for all parties involved is for him to succeed at Barcelona. Our next bit of news is Toni Fernandez in the first team. And for those who've been following me now for the last year, you know I've talked about Toni Fernandez. I've written about him on Barca blog, but hey, here's another introduction to who Toni Fernandez is. A year ago, Fernandez was playing with the U18s as a 15-year-old. He was getting a spot on the bench in the UEFA Youth League and was seen as a player with high potential who is going to start to break in. Now, he's the fourth youngest player to debut for the club and has been named to the squad for the Spanish Super Cup. Only Lamine Yamal, Armand Martinez-Sagi, and Paulino Alcantara were younger when they debuted, with Alcantara beating Fernandez by just 10 days and more than 100 years. And bringing up Armand Martinez-Sagi always gives me the opportunity to talk about his sister, Ana Martinez-Sagi, who was the first female director for Barcelona's board back in the 30s, who I did do a history show on last year. So check that out on the channel or on the podcast. Now, Toni getting his debut before his cousin Guy Fernandez is a bit of a surprise for those who've been watching both for the last few seasons, because Guy was talked about in many circles last season as the much more prepared for the first team, largely due to his physicality and the fact that he just looks on paper more prepared for top flight football. That has been evidenced by his starting spot, that being Guy's, with Barca Athletic this season, always in the middle of the field. Toni, meanwhile, is a different type of player with a slighter frame and more questions about his long-term best position. In the academy, he played as a center forward, an attacking midfielder, and a right winger, using his talented left foot to cause havoc in every spot. 2 seasons ago, playing with the U15s, he scored 29 goals and snagged 9 assists, showcasing his massive skills in the build-up phases can translate to end product. But him being in the squad is something that I spoke about a few weeks ago when I made that video about Lamine Yamal and how desperate Barcelona is to basically have him healthy and playing for them game in and game out, that Barcelona should get some kind of player that is the most similar to him on their bench to come in for him, which Rafinha, even on the right, doesn't necessarily do. Fermin Lopez doesn't necessarily do. There is no natural right winger like Lamine Yamal, a player that is going to cut inside on a left foot and be really dangerous in the middle, but can start on the touchline and take on at least one player and attract that attention. Not that Lamine Yamal does, of course. He's ranking so high in all those different metrics, really as the best right winger in world football, just behind Salah at the moment. So he is number 2. But Toni Fernandez is the best like-for-like replacement, I think, for Lamine Yamal. And it makes a lot of sense to me that Hansi Flick now has him in the squad. You just wonder how often he's going to be making that bench in the second half of the season. And then our last piece of news is the Spanish Super Cup preview, because it is El Clasico again. As I already said, unfortunately, I will not have a watch along on Big Up, but I will have a 5 headlines on the podcast app as well as on the YouTube channel. So we do have another edition of El Clasico in the Spanish Super Cup final, which is where Barcelona won the trophy 2 years ago in 2023 after beating Athletic Club this season, and then Real Madrid getting past Mallorca 3-0. With Barca's recent form in the league, but the good showing against Athletic Club, and then Real Madrid's pretty good form in the league, but I know they won 3-0. I did watch the match, and this isn't just me being anti-Real Madrid. They did not play well in that game. They had 2 stoppage time goals when Mallorca were pushing bodies forward. The only thing to me in that game against Mallorca that was deserving of the win, they did dominate Mallorca in terms of the mentality. We know that Madrid's mentality is top, it's peak. They're willing to get into the scrums. They don't care about bad headlines in Spain, and their mentality was the most elite part of their performance. They got under Mallorca's skin. They probably got lucky with a second yellow for Bellingham that he deserved that he did not get. They employed the dark arts with the lead, and then they were ruthless, as I said, putting that game on ice in stoppage time with the 2 goals. The earlier Barcelona win this season against Real Madrid, at this point, it feels like a decade ago, but here's hoping that they can use Real Madrid to again get back to their best and be the better side. Because I'll reiterate, I was not impressed with Real Madrid and their performance yesterday against Mallorca, but I was pretty happy with Barcelona's showing against Athletic Club, as much as the second half of the first half, there we go, was not as good as it could have been. There's a lot of football left to be played, and the first trophy is on the line on Sunday. So I look forward to talking to you after that match for the 5 headlines. Again, then you can join me on Wednesday on Big Up for that Copa del Rey match against Vitor Roque and Real Betis. So that'll be fun. And hey, all these different competitions means that Barcelona is still alive in all these competitions and could win some trophies this season, which in 4 different competitions, Barcelona and Hansi Flick need at least 1 or 2. So I do hope you continue to join me on this journey, whether as a Patreon, whether on Big Up, or on the YouTube channel, or on the podcast apps, or even on the merch store to help me out in public out there in what we call the real world. Well, this was a breakdown for Barcelona's world in at least the last 48 hours. This was one of those 48 hours felt like a decade of news. So I'm glad I got to talk to you with this little special show today. And as always, until next time, Forza Barca.